The lake wasn't supposed to have a name. Tucked away in the forgotten woods outside the small town of Cedar Hollow, it didn't appear on any map. Most of the locals referred to it as the Black Water, a nickname whispered with unease. Few people ventured near it, and even fewer spoke about why. For Clara Winslow, the lake was a memory, a faint, half-formed image from her childhood. A girl in a white dress, a ripple of water, a scream that echoed through the trees. But that was years ago, and Clara had convinced herself it was just a dream, a leftover fragment of a child's imagination. Until now. The day was warm for late autumn, with a crisp wind that carried the earthy scent of decaying leaves. Clara had come back to Cedar Hollow to clear out her late grandmother's house. It was supposed to be a quick visit, a weekend to box up old photo albums and antique furniture before selling the place. But something had drawn her to the edge of the forest, a whisper at the back of her mind, a memory just out of reach. The trail she followed was overgrown, the twisted roots of old oaks and maples snaking through the dirt like veins. It was the kind of path no one had walked in years, but her feet seemed to know the way. The lake emerged suddenly, its black surface still as glass. It reflected the gray clouds above like a perfect, unbroken mirror. Clara shivered, though the air wasn't cold. She had expected the place to feel smaller, less intimidating. But standing there now, she realized just how wrong she'd been. The lake was vast, its shoreline disappearing into a wall of trees. The water was so dark it seemed to swallow the light, and the silence that surrounded it was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of a tree in the wind. Clara stepped closer, the dead leaves crunching beneath her boots. Her heart beat faster, though she didn't know why. Something about the lake felt off. And then she saw it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a pale shape beneath the surface, just at the edge of her vision. But as she squinted, it became clearer. A figure, floating just below the waterline. Her breath caught in her throat as she stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's not real." But it was. The figure drifted closer, and Clara could see now that it was a girl, her hair fanning out around her like a halo. Her eyes were open, wide, and staring, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. She was wearing a white dress, its fabric billowing in the water like smoke. Clara's chest tightened, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs refused to move. She could only stare as the girl's face broke the surface of the water. And then she spoke. "You came back," the girl whispered, her voice soft and broken, as though it hadn't been used in years. Clara's knees buckled and she fell to the ground. Who are you?" she managed to choke out. The girl tilted her head, her movements slow and unnatural, like a marionette being guided by invisible strings. Her pale lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her dead eyes. "You don't remember me?" she asked, her voice laced with quiet malice. "But I remember you." Clara shook her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "I've never been here before." The girl's smile widened, her teeth sharp and glistening. "Yes, you have," she said, "and you left me here." The water around her began to ripple, small waves lapping at the shore. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter, high and childish, but wrong in a way Clara couldn't explain. She scrambled to her feet, her instincts screaming at her to run. But before she could take a step, the girl's hand shot out of the water, gripping her ankle. With a strength that didn't belong to something so small, Clara screamed, falling backward onto the muddy shore. The girl's grip was ice cold, her nails digging into Clara's skin. "You can't leave," the girl said, her voice no longer soft, but harsh and commanding. "Not this time." The water surged forward, soaking Clara's legs and pulling her closer to the edge. She clawed at the ground, her hands slipping in the mud, but it was no use. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The girl let go, sinking back into the water with a soft splash. The lake was calm again, its surface unbroken, as though nothing had happened. Clara sat there, trembling and gasping for air, her ankle throbbing where the girl had grabbed her. And then she saw it, a single white ribbon tangled in the reeds at the edge of the lake. It wasn't hers. Clara stared at the ribbon, her mind racing. It was pristine, impossibly clean, as if the mud and decay of the lake hadn't dared to touch it. The white fabric fluttered faintly in the breeze, its delicate loops caught on the sharp reeds at the edge of the water. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed the fabric, a chill ran up her arm. It wasn't just cold, it was deeper than that, a biting frost that seemed to sink into her bones. She snatched her hand back, but the ribbon clung to her palm as if it had been waiting for her. Clara's breath quickened. She tried to let it go, shaking her hand frantically, but the ribbon wouldn't fall. Instead, it began to unfurl, its length growing impossibly long, wrapping itself around her wrist like a snake. She clawed at it, her nails scraping her skin, but the fabric only tightened. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice echoing across the empty lake. The ribbon stilled, as if acknowledging her plea. Slowly, it loosened its grip, dropping into her lap in a neat, harmless coil. Clara stared at it, her chest heaving, her mind grasping for logic in a situation that defied explanation. She wanted to throw it back into the water, to leave this cursed place and never return. But something about the ribbon stopped her. It felt familiar. Clara held it up, her fingers trembling. The faintest trace of perfume clung to the fabric, a scent she hadn't smelled in years. It was sweet and floral, with an edge of something metallic. Memories flickered at the edges of her mind. A warm summer day, a child's laughter, a sharp scream. Her stomach churned. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But it was. The ribbon had belonged to Abigail. Clara's heart sank as the name surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. Abigail Carlson, the girl she'd grown up with, the girl who had disappeared when they were just 10 years old, the girl everyone said had drowned in the lake. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, willing the memory away. She had spent years burying it, convincing herself she had no part in what happened that day. But now, the past was clawing its way back, refusing to be ignored. "Clara?" The voice was faint, carried on the wind. It sent a shiver down her spine. She whipped her head around, her eyes scanning the tree line. The lake was still, the woods silent, but she wasn't alone. She could feel it. "Clara, Ed!" This time the voice was louder, coming from the lake itself. Her blood ran cold as she saw the ripples spreading across the surface of the water. They radiated outward, slow and deliberate, as if something was moving beneath. Clara stumbled to her feet, clutching the ribbon in her fist. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The water parted. Abigail's face emerged first, her pale skin glistening with dark, murky water. Her hair clung to her skull in tangled strands, and her eyes, clouded and lifeless, locked onto Clara's. "You left me," Abigail whispered, her lips barely moving. Her voice was wrong, layered with a wet, gurgling undertone that made Clara's stomach turn. Clara took a step back, shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice breaking. You fell in. I couldn't reach you." "You didn't try," Abigail interrupted, her voice sharp now, filled with venom. "You ran. You left me here." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "That's not true," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I was just a kid. I didn't know what to do." Abigail's head tilted, her expression cold and unreadable. "You knew enough to run," she said, "enough to lie." The ripples around her grew more violent, the water churning as if the lake itself was alive. "I didn't lie," Clara insisted, her voice rising. "I told them what happened. I told them it was an accident." Abigail's smile was thin and cruel. "Is that what you tell yourself?" she asked. That it was an accident? Clara's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees, the ribbon slipping from her grasp. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out Abigail's voice. But it was inside her now, echoing in her mind. "You left me," Abigail said again, her tone softer, but no less damning. "And now you're back." The water surged forward, soaking Clara's knees as Abigail rose higher, her body emerging from the lake. Her white dress clung to her skeletal frame, the fabric stained with streaks of algae and mud. Clara couldn't look away. She was paralyzed, trapped in Abigail's unrelenting gaze. "You have to fix it," Abigail said, her voice now eerily calm. "You have to make it right." Clara shook her head, her tears falling freely. "I don't know how," she said. "I don't even know what you want." Abigail leaned closer, her cold breath washing over Clara's face. "You will," she whispered. "Because if you don't—" The lake behind her began to bubble, dark shapes rising to the surface, more figures, more children, their pale faces breaking the water one by one. "You'll join us?" Clara couldn't breathe. The lake churned violently as more faces emerged, their hollow eyes fixed on her. Boys and girls of varying ages, their bodies bloated and gray, rose from the water in a slow, deliberate procession. Their hands clawed at the surface, their mouths opening and closing as if gasping for air they would never breathe again. Her hands shook as she tried to push herself backward, but her legs refused to obey. The mud beneath her knees seemed to hold her in place, as if the lake itself was pulling her closer. Abigail stepped forward, her bare, waterlogged feet sinking into the mud. "They're waiting," she said softly, gesturing toward the lake. "You left them too." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. "I don't even know them," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the bubbling water. Abigail tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "But you will," she said, "because they're just like me. Forgotten. Abandoned." Clara shook her head, her tears mixing with the dirt on her face. "I didn't abandon you," she choked out. "It was an accident. I was scared. You lied," Abigail interrupted, her voice sharp. "You told everyone you didn't see what happened, that you didn't hear me scream." Clara froze, the memory clawing its way to the surface. She had heard the scream. She had seen Abigail struggling, her arms flailing as the lake pulled her under. But she hadn't moved. She had stood there, frozen with fear, until the water went still. When the adults came running, she had lied. She told them she had only just arrived, that she hadn't seen Abigail fall. She told herself it wasn't her fault. She was just a child. She didn't know what else to do. But now, staring into Abigail's lifeless eyes, she realized that excuse no longer mattered. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do." Abigail's expression didn't change. "Sorry isn't enough," she said. "Not for me, not for them." The other children moved closer, their movements slow and jerky, their dead eyes fixed on Clara. The air grew colder, the frost creeping across the ground and biting at her skin. "What do you want from me?" Clara pleaded, her voice trembling. "What can I do?" Abigail knelt in front of her, their faces inches apart. The sickly scent of the lake clung to her, a mix of algae and decay. "You have to take our place," she said, her voice almost gentle now. "Only then can we rest." Clara's stomach turned. "Take your place?" she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Abigail nodded. "You have to go into the lake," she said. "You have to join us." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "No," she said, shaking her head violently. "I can't. I'll drown." Abigail's smile was cold. "That's the point," she said. "A life for a life. That's how it works." The children began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, a haunting melody that echoed through the clearing. Clara couldn't make out the words, but the sounds seeped into her mind, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. "I can't do it," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't die for you." Abigail's expression hardened. "Then you'll never leave," she said. "You'll wander these woods forever, just like we did. You'll hear the bell, you'll feel the water, and you'll know you could have stopped it." Clara looked around frantically, searching for a way out, but the forest was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of black water. The lake stretched in every direction, its surface broken only by the pale faces of the children. "You can't escape," Abigail said, her voice calm but unyielding. "The lake doesn't let go." Clara's hands gripped the ribbon in her lap, the fabric still cold and damp. "There has to be another way," she said desperately. "Something else I can do?" Abigail tilted her head, considering her for a moment. "There's only one way out," she said. "But if you won't take it—" She stepped back, raising a hand. The water behind her surged upward, forming a massive wave that loomed over Clara. "Then the lake will decide for you." Clara screamed as the wave crashed down, dragging her into the icy depths. The cold stole the air from her lungs as the water closed over her head, pulling her deeper and deeper into the darkness. She clawed at the water, her lungs burning, but it was no use. The lake was alive, its currents pulling her down with an unnatural force. As her vision blurred, she saw them, Abigail and the other children, their faces distorted by the water. They surrounded her, their mouths moving in silent chants, their hands reaching for her. And then, just as the darkness began to close in, she saw it. A faint light, flickering at the edge of her vision. The ribbon in her hand began to glow, its light piercing through the water. Clara's chest heaved as she clawed toward it, the last remnants of her strength propelling her forward, and then everything went black. Clara woke, gasping for air. She was lying on the muddy shore of the lake, her body soaked and trembling. The ribbon, still glowing faintly, was wrapped tightly around her hand, its light pulsing like a weak heartbeat. Her chest heaved as she rolled onto her side, coughing up water that burned her throat. For a moment she thought she was alone. The lake was still, its surface reflecting the pale moonlight. The forest around her was silent, as if holding its breath. But then she felt it, the weight of their stares. The children stood in a half circle at the water's edge, their dead eyes fixed on her. Abigail stood at the center, her pale face illuminated by the ribbon's faint glow. "You came back," Abigail said, her voice cold and sharp. "But you didn't finish it." Clara tried to speak, but her throat felt raw, her voice a faint croak. I tried," she managed to say. "I don't understand what you want from me." Abigail stepped forward, her bare feet leaving no trace in the mud. "You were supposed to take our place," she said, "but the lake let you go." Clara's mind raced, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why didn't it take me?" Abigail's expression darkened, her lips curling into a sneer. "Because it still wants you to choose," she said. "You can't just be dragged under. You have to give yourself to it." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't," she whispered. "I don't want to die." Abigail's eyes narrowed. "And neither did we." The other children stepped forward in unison, their pale forms ghostly in the moonlight. Their voices rose in a haunting chant, the same rhythmic melody Clara had heard before. The sound wrapped around her, filling her ears and her mind, pulling her toward the water. The ribbon in her hand pulsed brighter, the light flickering erratically. It seemed to push back against the children's chant, its glow spreading across the shore. Clara gripped it tightly, her knuckles white. "What is this?" she demanded, holding it up. "Why does it keep me here?" Abigail tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with malice. "It's what binds us," she said. "A piece of what you took that day." Clara froze. "What I took?" "You don't remember?" Abigail asked, her voice dripping with venom. "The ribbon was mine. You pulled it from my hair while I was in the water. You took it and ran." The memory hit Clara like a thunderclap. She saw herself as a child standing at the edge of the lake. Abigail was in the water, laughing as she waded deeper. Clara had grabbed the ribbon as a joke, yanking it free from Abigail's hair. She had been laughing, teasing her friend, and then Abigail slipped. Her laughter turned to screams, her hands flailing as she sank beneath the surface. Clara had stood frozen, clutching the ribbon as the dark water swallowed her best friend. "I didn't mean to," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. "I was just a kid. I didn't know." "You knew enough to run," Abigail snapped, her voice cutting through Clara's excuses. "You knew enough to leave me there." The children's chant grew louder, the sound vibrating through the ground. The water behind them rippled violently, waves lapping at the shore. "You can't undo what you did," Abigail said, "but you can choose how it ends." Clara's grip on the ribbon faltered. The glowing fabric seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, as if urging her forward. "How?" she asked, tears blurring her vision. "How do I fix this?" Abigail stepped closer, her cold breath visible in the air. "You give it back," she said. "You give the ribbon to the lake, and then you go in after it." Clara's chest tightened. "And if I don't?" The other children stepped forward, their dead eyes narrowing. "Then the lake will keep taking," Abigail said. "One by one. It doesn't stop." Clara's hands trembled as she stared at the ribbon. The fabric felt alive, its light dimming and brightening as if it were waiting for her decision. The lake began to churn, the dark water reaching for her like fingers. The children's chant grew deafening, their voices blending into a single haunting cry. "Choose, choose, choose." Clara's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling in a chaotic loop. She wanted to scream, to run, to wake up from this nightmare. But deep down, she knew there was no escape. She had come back to this place for a reason. Taking a deep breath, she stepped toward the water. Abigail's eyes glinted with something that looked like approval. "That's it," she said softly. "You're almost there." The water was freezing, the cold biting into Clara's legs as she waded deeper. The ribbon in her hand glowed brighter, its light casting eerie shadows across the children's faces. As she reached the center of the lake, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint lapping of water against her body. Clara held the ribbon out in front of her, her fingers trembling. "Take it," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Take it, and let me go." The water surged forward, pulling her under. Clara plunged into the icy depths, the ribbon still glowing faintly in her grip as the lake swallowed her whole. The cold was unbearable, slicing through her like shards of glass. Her chest burned, her lungs screaming for air, but the water dragged her deeper and deeper, as if the lake itself was alive. She opened her eyes, the murky darkness around her swirling like a living shadow. The ribbon in her hand glowed brighter, its light piercing through the gloom, revealing the faces of the children. They floated around her, their expressions hollow and blank, their pale hands reaching toward her. Abigail was there too, her hair billowing like smoke in the water. Her eyes locked onto Clara's, cold and unrelenting. "It's time," Abigail said, her voice echoing in Clara's mind even though her lips didn't move. "Give it back." Clara's fingers trembled as she held out the ribbon. It unraveled from her hand, drifting through the water like a tendril of light. Abigail reached for it, her pale fingers brushing against the glowing fabric. The moment she touched it, the lake erupted with light. The children around them froze, their forms dissolving into the brightness. The ribbon pulsed, its glow spreading outward, illuminating the lake in a way Clara had never seen before. The water turned clear, and for the first time, she could see the bottom. There, resting beneath layers of silt and tangled weeds, were dozens of ribbons, white, red, blue, yellow, each one tied to a memory, a life stolen by the lake. Clara's breath caught as the ribbons began to stir, their colors glowing faintly. The light spread through the water, soft and warm, driving away the cold. The children's faces became clearer, their expressions softening as the ribbons floated upward, breaking the surface. Abigail looked back at Clara, her lips curving into a faint smile. For the first time, she didn't seem angry. "Thank you," she whispered. And then she was gone. Clara felt the pull of the lake lessen, the weight of its grasp lifting from her body. She kicked her legs, propelling herself upward, desperate for air. The light surrounded her, guiding her toward the surface. Her head broke through the water, and she gasped, the cool night air filling her lungs. She floated there for a moment, her body trembling as the lake around her grew still. The ribbons were gone, their glow fading into the night sky like fireflies. The shoreline was empty, the children no longer waiting for her. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. Clara swam to the edge of the lake, her arms and legs heavy with exhaustion. She pulled herself onto the muddy ground, collapsing in a heap. The forest around her was quiet, the oppressive darkness replaced by a soft, almost peaceful stillness. She sat up slowly, her breath visible in the cold night air. The lake was calm now, its surface smooth and glassy, reflecting the pale moonlight. It looked ordinary. But Clara knew better. She stared at the water, her thoughts racing. The ribbon, the children, Abigail. They were gone. She had returned what she had taken, ended the cycle that had trapped them for so long. But as she sat there, a new thought began to creep into her mind. What about her? Clara's hands trembled as she looked down at her reflection in the water. Her face stared back at her, pale and drawn. But her eyes were wrong. They were hollow. Her breath hitched as she scrambled back from the water, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to look away, but the reflection didn't fade. The hollow eyes stared back at her, unblinking. "You can't leave," a voice whispered behind her. Clara spun around, but the shoreline was empty. The forest loomed in the distance, quiet and unmoving. Her heart raced as she turned back to the water. The reflection was gone, but the voice remained. "It doesn't let go," it whispered, soft and chilling. Clara stumbled to her feet, her body weak and unsteady. She wanted to run, to leave this place behind, but her legs wouldn't move. The weight of the lake still clung to her, an invisible tether she couldn't break. She looked back at the water one last time, her chest tightening as a single ripple broke the surface. And then she understood. The lake had taken something from her, just as it had taken from Abigail, from the children. The cycle wasn't broken. It had simply changed. The lake had chosen her. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as she stepped back, her feet sinking into the mud. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around her like a shroud, and the faint sound of a bell echoed in the distance. She closed her eyes, the weight of the lake pressing down on her. And when she opened them again, the water was calm, and she was gone. The lake waits. It always does.